Then I said I understand Tony, I don't visit Hollywood very often and I don't make it to public scenes and I don't go to clubs because I don't like drinking and doing drugs because I'm not a teenager or a kid anymore, although I have to admit when I hit puberty and I became a teenager I did create myself the perfect fake driver's license saying I'm 24 years old and those were good times. Especially when I started doing it with Jessica Jones and then I smiled warmly at my wife and Jessica smiled back at me and then I said you need to stop drinking Tony and stop going to parties and clubs because you're not a kid anymore. Oh, and tell Pepper Potts you love her, and also if you become a superhero make sure your suit is red and yellow or red and gold and call yourself Iron Man. And then I smirked and said I think you will like it and you can call me Infinity. And then I said okay, so I think I've had enough of Burger King for today. And then I gave Tony Stark my business card that has an infinity symbol on it along with all my contact information and my name, and I said here, call me anytime Tony, especially if you need help. And then I said I have to go now because I have a city to protect, I'll see you later Tony Stark. And then I teleported away from Tony Stark and James Rhodes, and then Tony Stark tried to say wait, you gave me 2 business cards. And then I said inside Tony's mind, give one of my business cards to James Rhodes. And then Tony Stark said here, take this Rhodey. And then James Rhodes said okay, so this is his calling card, good, at least I know I call him anytime I want. And then Tony Stark said yes, I'm definitely calling him soon. And then James Rhodes said yeah, you will probably forget about him in like a day. And then Tony Stark said no I won't, he made a great first impression on me. And then when Tony Stark got back home he told Jarvis about me and he said Jarvis, this is a reminder for me to call James Gray for any emergencies or if I'm in trouble, and I also want you to call James Gray if I'm in any danger or if I need help Jarvis. And then Jarvis said message received, I will remind you to call him and I will also call James Gray if you're in mortal danger, sir. And then Jarvis asked Tony Stark, should that also be classified as emergencies, sir? And then he said yes, and I just don't want to forget about James Gray and also bring up all the information you have on him. And then Jarvis showed Tony Stark all me and Jessica's work as private investigators in New York City. And then Tony Stark whistled and he said wow, now that's a life well spent, now I like this kid. And then he asked Jarvis what's his arrest record, Jarvis, and then he said James Gray has arrested over 2,000 criminals, sir, the exact number of his arrests are 2020. And then Tony Stark asked what's his wife Jessica's arrest record, and then Jarvis said 1,500 criminals have been arrested by Jessica Jones and that's the exact number, sir. And Tony Stark whistled again and he said wow, that's a lot of angry criminals if they ever end up in prison themselves, but then again they don't have anything to worry about. And then when me and Jessica Jones went back home to our apartment, Jessica Jones and I made love again in our soundproof bedroom while the kids played video games and watched TV in their bedroom. And then while I was making love to my wife Jessica Jones again, I secretly gave her true invincibility so no one could kill her, and she can even deactivate her invincibility with voice commands. And after me and Jessica Jones were done making love again, I said to Jessica Jones, I gave you invincibility, Jessica, and you deactivate or turn it on by using voice commands by saying invincibility off and invincibility on. You can command your invincible body, and I can also do the same thing with my invincibility. And then she smiled at me and said you didn't have to do that. And then I said wrong, I definitely wanted to do it and think of it like permanent health coverage. And then she said yeah, that's the best healthcare plan, really. And then Jessica Jones joked with me and said next you will probably give me all the abilities of Supergirl. And then I said well, I can actually do that and then some, and I can even make you immune to all kryptonite. And then Jessica Jones said I was kidding, but I would love to fly and run at super speed. And then I touched Jessica Jones on the belly and a warm white glow came from my hand and I said done, you can now fly and move and run at super speed, Jessica Jones. And then she said cool, can I use voice commands to deactivate that too? And then I said yes ma'am. And then I asked Jessica Jones, did you need anything else honey? And then she said well, I would like something else good to eat and I'm thinking Pizza Hut. And then I snapped my fingers and I asked her and what to drink, and then she said I want peach tea, and I snapped my fingers again. And then my wife Jessica Jones kissed me on the cheek and she said thank you handsome.